Rolling Hills Asylum was not always the broken, decaying building that it is today. Long ago, it was a place where people were sent to be forgotten. The poor, the mentally ill, the sick, and the unwanted were locked away behind its cold stone walls, left to live out their days in misery. Built in the late 18s, the asylum was meant to provide care, but what happened inside was far from caring. Patients were often mistreated, isolated, and left to suffer in silence. Overcrowded conditions, cruel experiments, and the screams of the hopeless created a dark atmosphere that never left. The asylum finally closed in the 1970s, but it wasn't because the suffering stopped. No, the screams of the tormented souls still echo through its empty halls. Locals began whispering about strange occurrences, flickering lights, cold spots, and eerie voices coming from the abandoned building. Some who dared to enter spoke of shadowy figures and faces peeking from broken windows. But many of those stories ended in disaster. The deeper people went into Rolling Hills, the more likely they were to never return. Those who did were forever changed, haunted by what they saw, or worse, what they felt. Years later, a new family moved into a nearby town. They had heard the local legends, but none of them believed in ghosts. In fact, they found the stories amusing, especially the teenage son. Fascinated by paranormal activity and armed with a camera, he convinced his family to visit the old asylum for an adventure. "It'll just be a fun scare," he said, unaware that what awaited them inside Rolling Hills was more than just a story. That decision would become the biggest mistake of their lives. What they found in Rolling Hills would prove that some places are never really abandoned. The family thought it would be their first and last visit to the haunted asylum, but they didn't know it would also be their final visit anywhere. The family arrived at Rolling Hills just before the sun began to set. The asylum loomed before them like a giant tombstone, towering over the trees, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes. The building seemed to breathe with the wind, creaking and groaning and as if alive. Weeds and vines had overtaken the once grand entrance, wrapping around the cracked stone like nature's way of keeping something evil inside. The air was still, unnaturally quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The teenage son, eager and excited, was the first to step forward. Camera in hand, he filmed the asylum's exterior as he led the way. His parents followed behind, slower, more hesitant. The mother clutched the hand of her youngest child, a little girl who had been uneasy from the start. The father, trying to keep his composure, forced a laugh. "It's just an old building," he said, but his voice wavered. They pushed open the heavy front door, which creaked loudly in protest, and stepped inside. The stale air hit them like a wall, musty, cold, and damp. The narrow hallways stretched ahead, lined with old hospital beds, rusted wheelchairs, and peeling wallpaper. Their footsteps echoed loudly, and every sound seemed to bounce off the walls, making it hard to tell where noises were coming from. As they wandered deeper into the asylum, strange things started happening. The younger child tugged at her mother's sleeve, insisting that she saw a shadow move down the hall. The mother brushed it off, assuming her daughter's imagination was running wild in the eerie atmosphere. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger for everyone. The teenage daughter felt a chill run down her spine as they passed an old operating room, and she swore she heard faint whispers coming from within, though no one else heard it. Despite the growing tension, the son pressed on, excited to capture something supernatural on camera. Every flicker of light or creak in the building made him more determined. He convinced the family to head toward the basement, where the asylum's morgue was located, rumored to be the most haunted part of the building. The parents exchanged uneasy glances, but reluctantly followed. They all told themselves it was just for fun, just a spooky adventure. But as they descended the stairs into the basement, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around them. None of them knew they were walking straight into the heart of the asylum's darkness, a place where the souls of the tortured still lingered, waiting for visitors to claim. As the family stepped into the basement, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath began to fog in front of them, despite it being a warm summer evening outside. The walls were damp, and the smell of decay hung thick in the air. The once functional morgue now resembled a crypt, filled with rusted gurneys, cracked tiles, and body drawers that had not been opened in decades. The light from their flashlights barely pierced the heavy darkness, creating long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. The younger child tugged at her mother's hand again, her voice trembling. "There's someone standing there," she whispered, pointing to the far corner of the room. The mother's heart skipped a beat as she glanced in the direction her daughter was pointing, but all she saw was the dark outline of an empty hospital bed. "There's nothing there, sweetheart," she said softly, trying to hide her growing unease. Suddenly, the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed throughout the basement, causing everyone to jump. The father rushed to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if someone was holding it closed. The tension in the room thickened. "It's just the wind," the father said, though he didn't sound convinced. The teenage daughter, who had been filming on her phone, suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others strained to listen, and then they heard it. A faint whispering, so quiet it seemed to come from the walls themselves. The words were unintelligible, but the sound sent chills down their spines. The daughter's hands shook as she played back the recording on her phone. On the screen, they saw strange orbs of light drifting across the room, and in the background, the faint image of a figure, blurred but unmistakable. The teenage son's excitement grew. "Did you see that? This is amazing." He aimed his camera toward the back of the room, eager to capture more evidence. But the rest of the family wasn't sharing his enthusiasm. The mother was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The younger child clung to her leg, whimpering. Even the father, who had been trying to stay calm, now had a look of deep concern on his face. The daughter took a step toward one of the body drawers, drawn by an eerie compulsion she couldn't explain. As she approached, the drawer slowly began to slide open on its own, the screeching sound of metal against metal filling the air. She stumbled back in terror, her flashlight flickering. "We need to get out of here," she gasped. But the son wasn't ready to leave. He was determined to find out more. "It's just getting good," he insisted, his voice echoing through the empty room. "There's more here. We just have to find it." The lights on their cameras began to flicker wildly, and a deep, guttural sound filled the room, something that wasn't human. The walls seemed to tremble, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. A cold gust of wind swept through the basement, sending papers flying and knocking over old equipment. The family huddled together, fear gripping them. It was clear now that something was watching them, something that didn't want them to leave. The family stood frozen in the dark, their breaths quick and shallow, as if the very air in the room had turned against them. The once faint whispers had grown louder, swirling around them like a chorus of voices trapped in time. The teenage son, still clutching his camera, could no longer mask his fear with curiosity. The excitement was gone, replaced by a deep sense of dread. His hands trembled as he filmed the cold, damp walls of the basement, capturing fleeting shadows that shouldn't have been there. "I'm not staying here any longer," the father finally said, his voice firm but edged with panic. He grabbed the handle of the door again, yanking it with all his strength, but it refused to move. "We need to find another way out." The son, who had been so eager to explore, was now the one urging them forward, deeper into the asylum, convinced they could find an alternate exit if they just pushed on. "There has to be another door," he said, though the doubt in his voice was obvious. With no other choice, the family reluctantly followed him, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The basement halls were narrow and winding, lined with old medical equipment, overturned gurneys, and broken glass that crunched under their feet. Faded signs with cryptic messages like patient isolation and quarantine were barely visible on the crumbling walls. The further they went, the colder it became, until it felt as though they had stepped into the belly of the building, a place untouched by light or warmth for decades. Suddenly, they came upon the morgue. The room was larger than they expected, and the air inside felt thick and oppressive. Rows of metal body drawers lined the walls, their handles rusted with time. An old autopsy table stood in the center of the room, its surface stained and cracked. The dim light from their flashlights barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when no one was looking. The mother, clutching her youngest child close, could feel her heart racing. The little girl had gone silent, her wide eyes fixed on something in the far corner of the room. "Mommy, there's someone there," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the stillness. The mother looked, but saw nothing. just an empty corner filled with dust and darkness. The father turned toward the body drawers, a sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. One of the drawers had been slightly pulled out, as if someone or something had recently opened it. He reached out cautiously, his hand trembling as he grasped the cold metal handle. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered under his breath, but it was too late. As he pulled the drawer open, a deafening bang echoed through the room. The drawer flew out violently, slamming against the wall, and the faint, ghostly shape of a figure appeared before them, so close they could feel the chill radiating from it. The figure wore a tattered hospital gown, its face pale and sunken, eyes hollow and dark. It stood silently, unmoving, as if watching them. The mother screamed, pulling her daughter close, and the teenage son's camera fell from his hands, clattering onto the floor. The figure remained, staring at them with those empty, soulless eyes. In an instant, the temperature dropped even further, freezing them to the bone. The lights from their flashlights flickered out, plunging them into total darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, closer. Footsteps echoed through the morgue, though none of them were moving. The spirits of the asylum's long-forgotten patients were awakening, drawn to the living souls that had dared to enter their domain. The father fumbled in the dark, desperately trying to find his family. But the cold, invisible hands of the spirits seemed to pull them apart. The mother's sobs filled the air, her daughter's voice trembling as she cried out for her brother. The teenage son, blinded by fear, scrambled to pick up his camera, but it no longer mattered. They were no longer alone. The spirits had claimed the asylum long ago, and now they were claiming them. The darkness swallowed them whole, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. The once faint whispers turned into urgent murmurs, voices speaking in languages they couldn't understand, as if the walls themselves were alive with the spirits of the dead. The teenage son fumbled with his camera, but no amount of technology could capture what was unfolding before them. This was not a mere ghost story, it was real. The family was split. The father had managed to find his son in the darkness, but the mother and younger child were nowhere to be seen. Panic set in. "Where are you?" the father shouted, his voice echoing through the hollow corridors. But there was no answer, just the unsettling hum of ghostly voices surrounding them. In another part of the asylum, the mother clutched her daughter tightly, trying to stay calm. But something wasn't right. The little girl who had been trembling with fear moments before was now eerily still. "Mommy, it's okay," she whispered, her voice distant and cold. The mother's heart skipped a beat. She looked down at her daughter, and for the first time, she saw it. The vacant stare, the unnatural stillness. The girl's eyes were glazed over, as though she was staring at something far beyond the walls of the asylum. "Mommy, they're here," the girl said softly, pointing to the darkness ahead. The mother's blood ran cold as she turned her gaze to where her daughter was pointing. There, standing in the shadows, were figures, several of them, ghostly outlines of people dressed in tattered hospital gowns, their faces pale and distorted. They moved slowly as if trapped in time, their empty eyes fixed on the mother and child. Paralyzed with fear, the mother tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't move. The air seemed to thicken around her, pressing in from all sides. The spirits moved closer, their whispering voices now clear, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Stay with us." Meanwhile, the father and son frantically searched the halls, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The son's camera captured fleeting glimpses of something in the shadows. Blurry figures, flickering lights, and strange translucent shapes. The father felt a hand brush against his shoulder, cold and clammy, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Suddenly they heard it, a faint voice calling out to them. "Dad, over here!" It was the daughter. Relief flooded the father's chest and he rushed toward the voice, the son following close behind. But as they rounded the corner, they stopped dead in their tracks. The daughter stood in the center of the hallway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her loomed the figure of a nurse, tall and menacing, with hollow eyes that bore into them. She was dressed in an old, blood-stained uniform, her bony hands gripping the girl's shoulders. The father gasped in horror as the nurse's mouth moved, though no sound came out. The daughter's eyes were filled with terror, but she couldn't move. Her body was frozen under the nurse's grip. "Let her go," the father shouted, rushing forward. But as he got closer, the nurse's figure seemed to dissolve into thin air, leaving only the daughter standing there, her face pale and blank. "They want us to stay, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They won't let us leave." The son, now visibly shaking, aimed his camera toward the hallway behind his sister. The red recording light blinked in the darkness, and as he zoomed in, he saw them. Dozens of spirits lining the hallway, their faces twisted with anger and pain. Some reached out with skeletal hands, while others stood motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on the family. Suddenly, the mother appeared from the shadows, running toward them with the younger child in her arms. "We need to go," she screamed, her voice hoarse and filled with desperation. The father grabbed his wife's hand, pulling her close as they all huddled together. But the spirits weren't finished with them yet. The shadows moved, closing in from all sides. The cold air grew colder still, and the whispers rose into a cacophony of screams. The ghostly figures advanced, their faces twisted with a mixture of sorrow and rage. It was then that the father realized the horrifying truth. The spirits weren't just haunting the asylum. They were trapping anyone who entered, adding to their numbers one by one. "Run!" the father shouted, dragging his family down the hall. But no matter how fast they ran, the walls seemed to stretch endlessly, the way out always just beyond reach. And then, without warning, the daughter screamed. The father turned just in time to see her being dragged backward by an unseen force, her body sliding across the cold floor as the spirits swarmed around her, her terrified eyes locked with his for a brief moment before she disappeared into the darkness. "No," the mother shrieked, reaching out, but it was too late. The daughter was gone, swallowed by the asylum and its restless dead. They had come looking for ghosts, but now they were the ones being hunted. The silence that followed the daughter's disappearance was deafening. The family stood in stunned horror, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The mother's sobs broke the stillness, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the cold floor. The father, paralyzed with shock, stared at the spot where his daughter had been only moments ago. She was gone, dragged into the abyss, and the terror in her eyes would haunt him forever. "We can't stay here," the father said, his voice breaking. "We have to go, now." But the asylum had other plans. As they turned to flee, the hallways seemed to warp around them, the walls shifting and narrowing, twisting into a labyrinth that defied logic. The once familiar paths they had walked moments before were now unrecognizable. The shadows grew darker, thicker, pressing in from all sides as the spirits closed in. The teenage son, who had been silent since his sister was taken, clutched the camera to his chest as if it was his last connection to reality. His hands were shaking, his breath shallow. "Dad, I don't think we can leave," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening pounding of his heart. The younger child clung to her mother, who was still sobbing, her eyes wide with terror. "They won't let us go," the girl whispered, her voice hollow, as if she had finally understood the true nature of the asylum. "They want us to stay, like the others." A loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer, the father grabbed his wife's hand and pulled her to her feet. "We don't have a choice. We have to get out," he said, his voice filled with a desperate determination. The family ran, their footsteps echoing down the dark, twisting corridors. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. Every turn they took only led them deeper into the asylum, the exit always just out of reach. The spirits followed, their ghostly forms appearing and disappearing in the shadows, their voices whispering in their ears, taunting them. Suddenly, they burst into a large, open room. The asylum's old operating theater. The dim light from their flashlights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the rusted surgical tools and decaying furniture. In the center of the room stood an old operating table, its surface stained with the memories of countless patients who had never left this place. The father's heart pounded in his chest as he frantically searched for a way out. His eyes fell on a set of double doors at the far end of the room. "There! That has to be an exit!" he shouted, his voice filled with a mix of hope and fear. But as they ran toward the doors, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air became thick with an unnatural cold, and the lights from their flashlights flickered and died. In the darkness, they heard it, a deep, guttural growl, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. The malevolent presence that had been stalking them throughout the asylum was no longer content to lurk in the shadows. The ghostly figure of the nurse appeared before them, her eyes black and empty, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. She floated toward them, her blood-stained uniform swaying as if caught in an invisible wind. Behind her, more spirits emerged, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes filled with the same rage and sorrow. The father pushed his family behind him, trying to shield them from the advancing spirits. "Stay behind me!" he shouted, though he knew it was futile. They were surrounded. The nurse's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her hollow eyes locked onto the father, and in an instant, the room seemed to collapse around them. The spirits closed in, their cold hands brushing against the family, their whispered voices growing louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the mother screamed. The younger child was pulled from her grasp by an unseen force. Her small body lifted into the air as the spirits swirled around her. The father lunged forward, trying to grab her, but his hands passed through her as if she were no longer real. The little girl's terrified screams echoed through the room as she was dragged into the darkness. The father collapsed to the ground, his hands trembling, his heart shattered. First his daughter, now his youngest child, both taken by the asylum, swallowed by its endless hunger. The mother fell to her knees beside him, her sobs racking her body. "Why is this happening?" she cried, her voice barely audible over the haunting whispers. The teenage son, still clutching his camera, stood frozen in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. The camera's red recording light blinked in the darkness, capturing every moment of the nightmare unfolding around them. But there was no longer any hope. They were trapped. As the spirits closed in, the father finally understood the truth. Rolling Hills Asylum wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the souls of those who entered, trapping them in its endless cycle of torment. And now it had claimed them, too. The room grew colder still, as if the life was being drained from the very air around them. The father's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared into the impenetrable darkness that had taken his children. The mother, broken and trembling, clung to his arm, but the strength in her grip was fading. There was no escape. They both knew it now. The teenage son, still in shock, stood motionless, his camera hanging limply in his hand. The red recording light blinked, the only flicker of life in the room, but the camera could do nothing to save them. It had captured every haunting second of their descent into madness, but there would be no one left to watch the footage. This was not a story with a happy ending. The nurse, the malevolent spirit that had tormented them from the start, floated closer, her hollow eyes fixated on the family. Behind her, the shadowy forms of the other spirits loomed, their twisted faces contorted in silent screams, as though they were reliving their own deaths over and over again. The nurse reached out with a pale skeletal hand, her fingers stretching toward the father. "Stay with us." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was everywhere, filling the room, echoing in their minds. The father tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead, weighed down by the crushing fear and hopelessness that now consumed him. His eyes darted toward the doors at the far end of the room, the ones he had hoped would lead them to safety. But they were gone. In their place, only more darkness. The asylum had shifted once again, trapping them in its endless maze of suffering. The mother's sobs grew weaker, her body shivering violently in the cold. "We have to go," she whispered, though even she no longer believed they could. "We can't stay here." But the spirits wouldn't let them go. The nurse's hand brushed against the father's face and a wave of freezing pain shot through his body, paralyzing him where he stood. The room seemed to tilt, the walls spinning as the spirits closed in from all sides. The whispers had become deafening now, a chorus of voices, each one begging, pleading for release, for vengeance, for company in their eternal prison. And then the father heard it, a familiar voice, faint but unmistakable. It was his daughter. "Dad, help me!" He turned, his heart lurching in his chest. There, just beyond the reach of the shadows, stood his daughter. Her pale face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. She reached out for him, her small hand trembling. Without thinking, the father staggered forward, his hands outstretched. "I'm coming," he cried, his voice breaking with desperation. But as his fingers brushed hers, the image of his daughter flickered and vanished. It had been an illusion, a cruel trick of the spirits to draw him in. And now there was no turning back. The shadows swallowed him whole. The mother screamed as the father disappeared into the darkness, his body dragged down by the relentless pull of the spirits. She clutched the teenage son, her nails digging into his arms, but there was nothing she could do. One by one, they were being claimed by the asylum, just as countless others had been before them. The teenage son, the last one left standing, felt the cold hands of the spirits closing in on him. The camera, still blinking in his hand, recorded his final moments as the ghostly figures surrounded him, their faces twisted with rage, sorrow, and hunger. The nurse floated closer, her empty eyes locking onto his. The last thing the son saw before the world went black was the twisted smile of the nurse, her face inches from his. And then, nothing. The camera hit the floor, its red lights still blinking as it lay abandoned in the empty operating room. The asylum had claimed another family, their screams lost in the endless halls of Rolling Hills. The spirits returned to their restless vigil, waiting for the next souls to wander into their domain. Rolling Hills Asylum stood silent once more, its dark legacy growing with each passing day. And as the camera's battery slowly died, the last whisper echoed through the darkness. Some places are never truly abandoned. They just wait.